The morning sun cast long shadows across my kitchen counter as I deliberately lingered over the final preparations for the holiday. Closing my laptop with a soft thud felt like locking away a private world that belonged exclusively to me, a sanctuary where order prevailed over chaos. Behind my eyes, the comforting glow of real estate spreadsheets remained, showcasing organized rows of rental income, property maintenance logs, and financial reserves. In my professional life, numbers always followed logical rules and behaved exactly as expected, which was a stark contrast to the unpredictable nature of human relationships. The sweet potato casserole rested quietly under a layer of aluminum foil, releasing a rich aroma of brown sugar, ground cinnamon, and roasted pecans into the air. It was a traditional family recipe passed down from my grandmother, though I had secretly altered it over the years by adding a tiny pinch of cayenne pepper to give it a sharper, unexpected depth. Nobody ever noticed the subtle transformation, or perhaps they simply never bothered to ask me about the secret ingredient. Golden autumn light streamed through the large windows of my modest condominium, softening the sharp edges of my deliberately minimalist surroundings. My plain grey sofa, neatly organized bookshelves, and the second-hand dining table I bought years ago all looked remarkably cozy in the warm morning glow. It was the kind of understated life that someone might easily mistake for struggling if they only glanced at the surface without understanding the wealth hidden beneath. I reached for my car keys on the entryway table but paused for a moment to study my reflection in the hallway mirror, seeing the same familiar face and practiced composure. Every single year, I foolishly told myself that this particular family gathering might be different, hoping my father would truly listen to my voice or that my mother would utter my name without immediately comparing me to my sister. Deep down, I knew better than to expect a miracle from people who had spent my entire life looking right through me. In our household, there were never simply two daughters growing up under the same roof. There was Chloe, and then there was me. Chloe was the shining star of every family gathering, her achievements polished to perfection and celebrated by everyone in our social circle. I was merely the background detail that people quickly skipped past whenever our family history was brought up in casual conversation. My father would always introduce her first, with immense pride radiating from his face, describing her as the ultimate proof of his parenting success. Then, almost as a delayed afterthought, he would glance in my direction and introduce me simply as Paige, offering nothing more to justify my existence. By the time I turned 25, I had already started building a substantial financial foundation, even though nobody in my family cared enough to comprehend what my career actually involved. My very first real estate purchase was a neglected, rundown duplex located over on Mason Street. The property possessed peeling exterior paint, a visibly sagging front porch, and a stubborn plumbing leak underneath the upstairs bathroom sink that constantly smelled of old plaster and rust. I completely emptied my personal savings account to secure the building, moving into the lower apartment, while renting the upper unit to a lovely retired teacher named Mrs. Gable. She always paid her rent days ahead of schedule and left homemade chocolate chip cookies on my doorstep every winter as an unbroken tradition. I enthusiastically shared the news of my first property purchase during a Sunday evening dinner, still naive enough to believe that personal achievement might finally earn me some respect. My father barely bothered to look up from his dinner plate, dismissing my hard work by claiming that owning a broken-down duplex was just an overly complicated way to struggle. My mother remained completely silent, as she always did whenever keeping her mouth shut preserved the peace at the table. Chloe just smiled condescendingly over the rim of her wine glass and asked if I worried about the dangerous element that such a neighborhood might attract. That specific evening was the exact moment something inside my heart stopped reaching out to them for validation or approval. It was not a sudden burst of bitterness or explosive anger, but rather a calm, clear decision to protect my own peace. After that painful dinner, I completely stopped explaining my business ventures, my financial goals, or my personal life to any of them. The next few years passed quietly, on the surface while I methodically expanded my real estate portfolio without making a sound. One building gradually turned into two properties became 4, and my real estate enterprise grew rapidly behind closed doors. Every single asset existed securely under a private corporate entity, keeping my actual name off public documents that could easily link back to me. To my relatives, I remained the exact same unremarkable daughter who wore practical clothes, drove an outdated vehicle, and owned cheap furniture. They routinely mistook my calculated financial discretion for a lack of ambition, and they assumed my silence meant I had nothing to show for my life. Then, roughly 3 years ago, a massive shift occurred in their lives that none of them ever managed to connect back to my business. My parents tragically lost their suburban home after my father's corporate position completely collapsed during a sudden wave of company downsizing. Facing severe financial hardship, they eventually applied for a vacant apartment located inside a beautifully renovated complex downtown. My father proudly signed the lease agreement himself, completely unaware of who actually owned the property management firm. He never discovered the truth behind the ownership, and I deliberately chose to keep that massive secret entirely to myself. On that particular Thanksgiving afternoon, I arrived at their apartment complex with the warm sweet potato casserole held carefully in my hands, feeling a familiar tightness tightening in my chest. The holiday dinner commenced exactly the way I anticipated, filled with loud laughter and endless updates regarding Chloe's newest business venture. The casual conversation effortlessly circled around everyone at the table while completely bypassing my existence, leaving me as a silent observer to my own family. Eventually, my father leaned back comfortably in his dining chair, clearing his throat before speaking loud enough for the entire room to hear. He looked directly at me and asked if I was still throwing my money away on rent every month. The busy dining table suddenly went completely quiet, creating an uncomfortable silence as 14 relatives eagerly waited to see how I would respond to the public humiliation. A split second later, my cell phone buzzed loudly against the wooden table, displaying a routine notification from my real estate software. I reached out my hand to grab the device, but my father suddenly snatched it off the table before I could stop him. He was clearly expecting to find an embarrassing text message or evidence of financial distress to validate his low opinion of me. Instead, his eyes locked onto a detailed digital rent ledger displaying the payment history for apartment 3C. The names listed on the active account were Richard Vance and Elaine Vance, marked clearly as fully paid for the current month. His facial expression instantly transformed into utter confusion before anyone else in the room could comprehend what the screen actually meant. He continued scrolling through the ownership documents in total silence, and the surrounding guests slowly began to realize that something incredible was happening. I calmly reached across the table to take my phone back from his trembling hands, gently placing my fork down against the ceramic plate. I looked my father dead in the eye and told him that since he wanted to know about my career, he should know that this entire building belonged to me. My voice remained perfectly steady as I explained that I owned this property, along with 3 other complexes, totaling 24 units. Chloe's confident expression completely collapsed into utter shock, while my mother stared at me as if a total stranger had suddenly taken my place. My father glanced around the dining room frantically, looking at the walls as if the very apartment had turned against him. Slowly, the puzzle pieces came together in his mind, and he finally understood why maintenance requests were always completed within hours, and why their complaints vanished. Absolutely nobody at the holiday table rushed forward to defend his arrogance, leaving him completely isolated in his embarrassment for the very first time. I stood up calmly from my chair, picked up my empty casserole dish, and reached for my winter coat hanging near the doorway. I looked at my parents and stated, evenly, that their current lease remained valid until the upcoming spring. After that date arrived, they would need to contact the corporate office to handle any future renewal discussions or rent adjustments. Not a single person in the crowded room uttered a word, and even my father remained completely frozen in his seat. I walked out of the apartment into the crisp, cold evening air without a single regret or a backward glance. For the first time in my life, I did not feel small leaving them behind. I felt completely finished with their judgment. Share your opinion by dropping comments. Like and subscribe my channel if you loved your parents.